Hello and welcome to Introduction to Ancient Wisdom. My name is Karina Wilkes. A little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Detroit, and I came here to Cleveland to work as a software engineer for a major financial institution. My spiritual journey started a long time ago when I was a child. I had an experience and it made me curious about what this really is that we're living in. What is reality? Why am I here? It's the question that many people ask. And like many people, the first thing that I grabbed onto was the thing closest to hand, which is Christianity. And after studying Christianity for a while, somewhere during my teen years, I kind of had the feeling that it wasn't going to answer the questions that I really wanted to have answered. So then began my journey outward, and I began to read up on many different things, esoteric ideas, Zen philosophies, Buddhism. I just ran the whole gamut. Any book I could get my hands on, I was reading it. Then after a little while, just reading about stuff wasn't enough. I needed to experience it hands-on. So I began to go to what we would now call a meetup. But back then, it was, little magazines that I would find on spirituality at little holes in the wall, little Wiccan shops or whatever, and I would pick out something to go to, and I would go, drumming festivals. I once attended a Lakota Sioux Inipi ceremony for a year. And during that time, I learned and I saw so much. I got exposed to perhaps things way beyond. And at some point, I became involved with Carlos Castaneda's crew through someone I met on the now defunct Spirit Web. But anyway, all of these experiences led me back around. And when I picked up the Bible again, many years later, after having gone through all these experiences, I saw it with different eyes. And I thought, it really would be wonderful if I could share some of these experiences and some of this knowledge that I've gleaned over the years with other people who might be on the path and not finding the answers that they're looking for. And really sharing that information so that maybe it could make their lives a little easier. So what is ancient wisdom? Well, ancient wisdom is a way of assessing reality. It is a way of looking at the world and defining it and sharing what it is that we are, what we're experiencing. And we all do that. And how we do that is through our language. We talk about what we're experiencing. Unfortunately, in our modern reality, we tend to compartmentalize our lives. Our work life is not the same as our family life, let's say, or our church life is something different entirely than our party life. But for the ancients, that was not the case. Everything was a part of experiencing the whole, or a part of their whole vision of reality. Everything has purpose. So when I'm out cutting grain for bread, I'm doing it for a reason. I'm doing it as a part of my spirituality, not just as a job that I'm doing for survival. They try to capture their ideas in symbols and in geometry. And we're going to get into what some of that symbolism really means for them. The other thing that they tried to capture was sequential and random reality. Now we do that too, but we're not consciously aware that we're doing it. And so we're going to talk about the differences between how we capture time and how they capture time. Lastly, we're going to talk about magic, what it is for the ancients and how we perceive it. So let's start with assessing reality. What is assessing reality? Well, We start off with our five senses. We see the world, we taste our foods, we smell different smells, we can feel cold and hot, we are sensitive to pressures. And through these five senses, we come to know the world out there. But really, the world out there doesn't exist. The world is really what we interpret it to be inside of our heads. And unless we have language, we don't have a way of sharing what it is that we're experiencing. Everything that we're experiencing is completely wrapped up in our own brains. There are no windows into the brain. The eyes are not actually windows. There's flesh there. And they send impulses of what they're seeing or experiencing out there and bring it into the brain, which then interprets those signals and creates what it is we experience. So the only way that we can really know for certain that things are going on and that we're sharing an experience is through our language. In our modern world, our language is basically definitions. We see an object, such as a cup, and from the earliest moments, we teach our children to identify the shape and call it a certain thing. But actually what we're doing is we're identifying energy patterns and putting labels on them. That's exactly what language is. So if I see the color red and I tell little Jimmy, hey, look, what color is that, little Jimmy? And he says red. And I say, very good. Very good. You see red and I see red. The truth of the matter is, I don't know what he's seeing. He could be seeing gray for all I know. All I know is that I'm training him to look at a certain energy pattern and define it as being red. Whether or not he's experiencing the same color I'm experiencing is totally unknown. In fact, science did some experiments and found out that there are people who are colorblind who actually don't experience the color red. And for the most part, they can identify the energy pattern, but what they're seeing is probably a sort of gray because there are certain greens that have the same appearance. And so science has been able to take the eyeballs of dead people and cut them open and find out that their cones for red are not developed. And so they're probably not experiencing what everyone else is experiencing, even if they're still able to identify that energy pattern and call it red. The next thing that we're going to talk about is symbols and numbers. A lot of the ancient languages weren't just flat languages like our languages today. They were also symbols and numbers for them. They were meant to contain more than just the definition of an energy pattern, but to link those energy patterns together through their symbolism and through their numeric value. As an example, I have here on the left our English letter A, and on the right I have the Hebrew letter Aleph. They're actually equivalent. Our English letter A comes from the Phoenician letter that both Hebrew and English comes from. So these are both representations of the letter A. On the left, however, when I was teaching kindergarten, and I would tell little Johnny, I'd say, when you see this letter, what are you supposed to say? And he'd say, A or Ah. That's all it means is a sound. It's one thing, A or Ah. It just denotes a sound. But the Hebrew letter Aleph is entirely different. It carries with it not only, unfortunately, there is no sound associated with the Aleph, but it takes on the sounds of all the letters that surround it, but we'll get into that in a moment. Its form is of a man, one hand reaching up to heaven, and the other hand reaching down to earth. And in between is a vav, or a barrier. And the aleph, or ox, as it's called the ox. The ox can reach across the barrier into the unknown, the great unknown that is out there, where all those energy patterns are. And it can bring information back across the vav to the material plane. And so the ox is associated with angels. We can see that in Ezekiel chapter 1 when he talks about the 4 living beings. And the 4 living beings have 4 faces each, one of a man, one of a lion, one of an eagle, and another of an ox. But in chapter 10, when he discusses those same beings, he sees the 4 faces, but instead of the ox, he sees a cherub. And anybody who has seen a picture of a cherubim or cherubim will probably pick up, if you did a Google search, you'll probably see pictures of little babies with wings. And really, it's a symbolic of an angelic being, right? A cherubim is an angelic being in the Bible, and it is the ox. So the ox is associated with an angel, that is, someone that carries a message from God to humanity. So there's a lot going on with this letter, and every time you see it, you are to invoke the whole story about this one letter. Now imagine a word. When we get to the word level, on our side, all we have is a definition, happy, and it just means a certain definition. When you do that in Hebrew, you get a whole novel worth of information that when it gets translated into a language like English, all of that information gets lost. On top of that, the aleph is a number. It stands for the number 1. Now back to its sound. Its sound is silence, because there is no discussing what is out there in the great unknown, in where everything is one. In Carlos Castaneda's books, he talks about shared reality as being like an island called the tonal. And on the island of the tonal, we all can agree on what we're experiencing. But the minute you leave off that island, you take a rowboat off that island, there is no language to describe or to talk about what goes on out in the great unknown. There's no language for it because we can't agree on what those things are. We see them as different things. We experience them different, and there is no agreement at all. So when people are talking about hearing sounds in their head, or they see a little flip of light flying through the room, they may very well be experiencing something. Who knows? We can't agree once we get off the island of the tonal. But the sounds that are associated with the ancient languages were usually based on mathematical principles. They were harmonics of some sort, and they had meaning beyond just having a sound. In fact, when we talk, we actually talk in a harmonic as well, but we don't usually recognize it as that. We don't recognize it until we hear something that isn't talking in harmonics. That is, let's say I talk in a monotone and I start to talk like this, then you can recognize that I am speaking in a sing-song kind of way, rather than monosyllables or monotones. I am singing the words. I am speaking this vibration into the universe in a certain key and a certain rhythm as well, because that is what's more pleasant for you to listen to. And we are accustomed to doing this without knowing that we're doing it. But the ancients were quite aware. And so when you hear chanting or ancient chants, they are speaking in mathematical terms, they are speaking in vibrational terms, not just speaking that way because that's the way that you speak. So it was very, very on purpose. The next part about this is correspondence. Now, when the Templars went into the Temple of Solomon and came back with all of these secrets from the Torah, they began to see that the English language had de-evolved, and so they started a system of correspondence. That is, they took different symbols and began to associate times of the month, different metals, all of these things together so that they could recreate what was already going on with ancient languages. Whether or not their correspondences are accurate or as accurate as the ancient languages is anyone's conjecture. But the fact is that things like numerology and those kinds of things evolve because of, like in Hebrew, they have gematria, where if you take a word and you add up the values of the letters, because each letter has an inherent value, they don't have a separate numbering system like we have. Like we have A, B, C, and 1, 2, 3. They don't have that. Their letters are their numbers. And so when they make a word, they make it very purposefully so that if another word has the same value, they are connected. There is another message going on in another dimension. So you can take those words or phrases even that have the same gematria and find equivalencies and find different pieces of a puzzle that helps to describe what's going on in the universe. Now let's talk about mathematics. Language and mathematics are usually not put together. And yet, language is math. It is a mathematical formula, both in its tonality and also in the way that we phrase things. Language helps us to locate an object in space. It helps us to tell where it is. And also, it helps us to tell when it is. For example, I could say a sentence that says, I read Catcher in the Rye when I was in the 9th grade. And I still have a copy of the book on a bookshelf in my library at home. Now, I've just done several things with that sentence. I have identified a certain energy pattern called The Catcher in the Rye as a book. And I told you that if you know how old I am, I'm blah, blah years old. If you know how old I am, I also told you how long ago it was I read it. And in the same sentence, I told you where it is located in my house. So if you know where I live, you can calculate the distance between you and the book. You can find it in space and time. And that is one of the very functions of language. As a programmer, I'm quite aware that when people talk about artificial intelligence or programming robots to do what we do, part of what we do is based on language. It helps us to randomly calculate from any position that we currently are to something located in space and time. And so language provides that random kind of generation of ideas so that we can do that. Without language, we would not be able to do that. We would not be able to share where something is with someone else. Right now, I want to take a look at the very nature of our minds. So we have come to associate language and math and logic with the left brain. And these things, whether you're talking about language, math, or logic, are random events that can happen at any point in time. For an example, I can give you a mathematical equation saying that Mary gave 2 apples to Sue, but that doesn't tell you when it happened. I could also say that Sue has 3 oranges, but those oranges, you don't know how long she's had them. She could have had them for 3 months, 3 minutes. It doesn't matter, because the events themselves are randomized in time. They're just general. And so it can apply to any time, even though I'm telling you some events that are happening in space. So the left side is random time, but the right side is sequential time. The right side is associated with visual imagery, music, facial recognition, and spatial abilities. In other words, imagine that you have a puzzle, and the puzzle is in 1,000 pieces, and they're randomized. You throw those puzzle pieces out there, and it's very hard to tell what the picture is because the pieces are in a random order. However, when you put the pieces in a sequential order, the picture becomes very clear. It's a park with a castle in the background, and there's some flowers in the foreground. You can tell exactly what it is. The same thing with music. If you were to take a piece of music and take the little bits and you take, let's say, each beat you take and randomize it, you will come up with an entirely different sound, and maybe it would not be recognizable as even music. It might be just a random jumble of mess. But having it in a sequential and logical order, it makes sense. That sound makes sense. Take a movie. If you were to shuffle the different frames of the movie in random order, the movie would not make sense. So the right side has to be presented in a sequential time order. Now I want to talk about the split brain experiment. Back in the 50s, when people had epilepsy, what doctors used to do is split their brain in half, separating the bad brain from the good brain, and so that the epilepsy would not take over the whole person. That was their reasoning. Thank God they don't do that anymore. They don't split the brain in half anymore. They have medicines that can dampen down some of those damaged areas that are firing and should not be when they should not be firing. But back when they did this, they did some experiments called the split brain experiments. And they would show pictures of objects to people who had their brains cut in half. And if they showed it on the right side and they asked the person what they saw, why, that person could right away say, "Oh, I saw a spoon." And they could tell you what it was that they saw. But if they flashed it on the left side, which corresponds with the right brain, since language is on the left side in most people, they would actually report that they didn't see anything, that nothing appeared before them. So this experiment was done over and over again, and it let science know that language is very important in what we experience as our reality. One of the things that Carlos Castaneda, and what I have found in most mystical systems, is that the main thing that you should accomplish, one of the first things you need to accomplish always, is calming the mind, what's called calming the mind. Carlos Castaneda calls it stopping the internal dialogue. What it is when you meditate, when you first start to meditate, you will notice that your brain is rapidly firing off a bunch of thoughts, and it is talking to itself in very rapid, random fire. It is speaking the world into existence. But when you learn how to stop the world or stop the internal dialogue, that process begins to break down. And what Carlos Castaneda called the second attention can come through. The first attention is the island of the tonal. That is that part of reality that we all agree is out there. That part of reality that we teach little kids to see by teaching them, you know, this is a cup, this is red, this is that, and labeling things for them. We teach them to focus on the tonal. He also calls it the rational mind. The rational mind needs the tonal to as its playground to have rational thought. The minute you stop the internal dialogue, there is no more rational thought. There's nothing to rationalize. There's no structures to base rationalism on. And that is when the tonal begins to shrink and you begin to see or have experiences from the other part of you that is in the second attention, which the Carlos Castaneda calls the nowl. The nowl is the greater you, the you that is connected to everything. And that you, the greater you, the higher self, what some esoteric traditions call it the higher self, can then start to come through or bleed through. And that's when you start having all your nice little experiences and start having your little gifts, as they call them. But while your language centers are full throttle, you're stuck on the island of the tonal. You can't leave it. So now let's talk about the other way that we assess reality through science. And what science does is it takes an observation, creates a theory as to why that event occurred, and then tries to find what triggers that event, so that we can understand how that event occurs in the first place. There are some limitations to science. First of all, people get it twisted all the time. The only reality that's out there is what you can observe. The only thing that is real is your observation. If you see a ball of light flying through your room, that experience, since you experienced it, is your reality. Because reality only happens inside of your head anyway. It doesn't happen anywhere else. It only happens in your brain. So if you saw something fly through the room and saw a little light, well, that experience happened. You experienced it. Now, why it happened or what caused it is a whole different ball of wax. Maybe someone was driving a car down the street and their headlights came through the windows in a certain way and made a flash of light go across the room. Or maybe you were seeing something else. Who knows? The reason for that experience is an entirely different thing. Science tries to understand the triggers for those types of things. But science can only deal with the tonal. It cannot deal with what's outside the tonal. That is the totality of existence, the totality of yourself. So science will always be limited in what it can say. It's very useful. We have made very great strides in technology because of science. But you have to realize that science is not the whole ball of wax. It's a part of the ball of wax. It helps us to understand the tonal. So now we come to everything has purpose. Everything is connected, even when we don't think that there is a connection. And that is the way that the ancients saw things. They saw things as being connected, connected ideas. We've gotten away from that. And even when we teach little kids in school, we teach them that reading and mathematics are two different subjects. They have nothing to do with each other. But I just showed you that language and math are one and the same thing. Language uses math so that you can locate things in space and time. We also think that chemistry and history have nothing to do together, when the opposite is true. Because any ideas that we build on to build our technology has a historical precedence. We're building on the discoveries of other people. So the more you know about those discoveries, the more you know about other people's thoughts, which is history, the faster you can make discoveries of your own. We compartmentalize our life. Like I said before, our work life and our play life, two different things. But for the ancients, all of these things were a part of a greater expression of self, of the higher self. And they wanted to know, what is it that they needed to be doing in their regular life to get connected to that higher self. We see religion and politics as two separate things. In fact, we say, separation of church and state for good reason, because people have used churches to try to control things and not really had everyone's best interest at heart. But for the ancients, that was not the case. They saw their political lives, again, as being a part of the expression of the higher self. So we can talk about events now. We look at events currently as linear. Something happens, time goes by, that's the past. What happened, that's the past. But for the ancients, everything was cyclical, because just as the days are cyclical and years are cyclical and seasons are cyclical, they saw energy patterns that would arise over and over again, and they mapped those energy patterns out. This gave birth to astrology and the Mayan sun calendar and all of those good things. Those are mappings of energy patterns that they would notice came about again and again and again, just like the seasons. They were connected to the motion of the universe. So our Earth goes around the sun goes around the Milky Way. The Milky Way is rotating around something else. They also connected things to the march of the equinox, which is the wobble that the Earth goes through, and it tilts every 26,000 years. It goes through all the zodiac symbols. So there is a book called Mexico Mystique by Frank Waters, and in it he talks about the rise and fall of civilizations that are mapped to this wobble of the Earth through the zodiac. And the rise and fall, just like clockwork, of a civilization is timed to, I think it's 1/10 of a degree of this cosmic calendar. And so it's a very interesting read if you want to pick that up. Everything happens in orders of magnitude. So an event that happens on a personal level can then happen to a family or a community or to a nation. It expands out. So the first time it happens maybe on a simple level of person, and then it happens on maybe the level of a nation, and then global, and then universal. But these energy patterns radiate out and repeat. The other thing that the ancients used was geometry. Here I have an example of a tetrahedron and a sphere, and these two were considered polar opposites of each other. One is, well, they're not really opposite per se. They're more like complementary geometries. The first represents male energy. It has very straight lines. Males tend to thrust into things. So when you look at little boys playing, they're playing with swords, they're fighting, they're ninja kicking each other. The little girls don't tend to do that. Their stuff is more inclusive. And so this male-female energy is something that the ancients defined as males move in straight lines. They want to thrust into a certain type of situation. Even the males' reproductive organs are for thrusting into, whereas the female's reproductive organs are to surround and include. So in the tetrahedron or the pyramid shape, all the pressure is on the bottom rung, and this allows for the energy to build up to the tip that can thrust into something new. Over here, this is a sphere, and every point on a sphere does exactly the same, has exactly the same amount of pressure or work, or does exactly the same amount of work as every other point on the surface of this sphere. There's no point that is doing more than or taking more burden than the other. It is an inclusive. This is the smallest geometry possible, or that we know of that's possible, is the tetrahedron. It's where we collapse all the energy into a single space so we can burst into something new. This energy is the largest geometry known that takes up a space. And it is so that things can become balanced and included. We have forgotten these lessons from the ancients, but we still kind of remember when we talk about capitalism and we see this diagram. I found this diagram on the internet of all the people holding up all the different levels in between, and at the top are the elite who do the least work but have all the wealth up there. This corresponds to that tetrahedron. It allows for energy to be concentrated at the very tip so that it can thrust into new and diverse things. What we're missing is, now this is another symbol I found on the internet when I looked up the word community. And community images are usually circular. They're usually showing people holding hands and in a circular motion. So these two ideas are still with us. They're just not a part of our consciousness. We don't consciously think of it in those terms, but the ancients apparently did. Anyway, their language and their symbols were meant as meditations to bring into their minds a remembrance of energy patterns and vibrations, so that when they went off the island of the tonal and they drew these symbols, they could meditate on them and bring themselves back to that state. They could remember without having a language to describe it. So that's why their symbols were so compacted and so full of information, because they used them to meditate on. One of the great geometries that they had was the seed and flower of life. It contains the entire story of the entire creation story. And what I want to do now is to show a brief movie, a brief video clip that kind of gives you an idea of how much information was included in their geometry. So let's go and watch that video.
Don't believe or disbelieve anything we discuss in spirit science. Simply have your own experience. In Lesson 6, I showed you an intro to sacred geometry, the flower of life. We looked at the Genesis pattern and how it forms the fruit of life, the pattern that all physical matter in existence comes out of. We jumped out of the sacred geometric pool for a few lessons, and today we're going to dive right back in. I've mentioned quite a few times that within the flower of life are found the music and harmonics of everything in existence. Let's find out how that works, shall we? First, I want to show you phi and Fibonacci. It's important to understand for what we're going to talk about. I'll show you what you need to know to continue, and if you want to learn more in depth about these sequences, I will provide sources in the comments. Phi, also known as the golden ratio or golden mean, is a very simple relationship. If you had a rod and were going to put a mark on it, only two places would mark the phi ratio, which is here or here. The length of A plus B is equal to the length of C. This ratio is 1.6180339 and continues on forever. If you multiply the length of C with phi, it will create the exact same image, only bigger. C and D is equal to E. This ratio could then span on forever, going smaller and smaller or bigger and bigger forever. This ratio is infinite. It has no beginning and no end. It is also believed that phi is the mathematical root of all other sequences. See, every mathematical sequence in existence needs a minimum of 3 numbers to figure out the sequence. Phi only needs 2. It is the only one. Similar to how the circle and square are the source of all shape, but we'll get to that later on. The next thing that you need to know is that this ratio is found in all life everywhere, sort of. By sort of, I mean it's really Fibonacci, but we'll look at that in a moment. Look at your hand. Not only does each finger have its own ratio moving up each finger, which is phi to the next bone, but it oscillates back and forth from the tallest finger to the thumb. You wonder why the human hand is like that? It's based on phi. This relationship is found throughout the body in various ways, moving up the arms and legs, in your face, throughout the entire body. This is a Greek statue that accurately represents this. The Greeks were very precise when they made their art, because they understood phi, Fibonacci, and the importance of these sequences. When the Romans took over Greece, you could see the perfection in statues just completely disappear. I'm not saying the Romans were bad artists, they just didn't measure everything to the same caliber that the Greeks did. Here is the phi ratio in butterflies. You can see this ratio everywhere, from the wing size to the body to the antennas. They're all phi ratios. Here's dragonflies. It's the same story. Phi runs along the entire body, and the relation to the body and the wings. Here it is in frogs. Phi is found throughout the body in relation to the head, to the arms, to the fingers, and so on. Well, what about fish? You'd think they wouldn't be found in fish. Well, here's 3 kinds of fish. Once again, the ratios are consistent. It doesn't just apply to these creatures though. Regardless of what mammal, insect, avian, plant, or living creature of any kind, you will find this ratio one way or another. There's a reason for this, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let me show you the importance we used to place on this golden ratio. In ancient times, we built many structures based on phi because we understood divine proportion. This is the pagoda of Yakushiji Temple in Japan. It's built with these same mathematics, from the doorway to the ball on top of the temple. It is a structural embodiment of the proportions that all life holds. The Parthenon in Greece also has the exact same mathematical structure, but even more. I recommend watching Nova's Secrets of the Parthenon if you wish to learn more about this, because the stuff that they find is really cool. The Great Pyramid in Giza also has these proportions. They're incredibly precise, perfect in every way. You'd think that by building these structures using the logical and mathematical proportions so carefully, that they would hinder the creativity behind these buildings, but they really don't. In fact, the left brain understanding all of this can even enhance creativity if used correctly. It makes me wonder about all of the world-famous buildings of the modern world. Could phi be a large factor in what makes them stand out? Let's move on to our next sequence, which is called Fibonacci. Now, the Fibonacci sequence is life's way of creating the golden mean. Allow me to explain. This sequence is continually made from adding the previous number to the current. 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 1 is 3, 3 and 2 is 5, 5 and 3 is 8. You can see how it continues. Now, what most people don't know about Fibonacci is that it actually continually strives closer and closer to the phi ratio. By dividing the current number into the last, you can see this happening. 1 into 1 is 1. Well, that's not close at all. 2 into 1 is 2. This time it's over phi, but closer. 3 into 2 is 1.5, which is under, but closer still. 5 into 3 is 1.666. This time it's over, but even closer. Continuing with that, it's 1.6, and then 1.625, 1.615384, 1.619048, and so on. It continually oscillates over and under the phi ratio, never quite making it there, but continuing on closer and closer every time, until eventually you can't even tell the difference. Because phi is an infinite number, this sequence will go on forever. Let's look at some spirals in nature, another way that phi and Fibonacci can manifest. This is a nautilus shell. Many people will say it's phi, but it's really Fibonacci. See how when it's in its earliest form, it's crude, not smooth or anything? One look and you can tell that's not phi. But as it goes out farther and farther, it gets closer and closer to phi. It becomes a nearly perfect phi spiral by the time it's all the way out here. This also happens with sunflowers, pine cones, and many plants in nature. In many cases, such as the pine cones and sunflowers, it flows in a double spiral or more, much like the spiraling arms of a galaxy. From the microcosm to the macrocosm, spirals are always present. So phi is basically source, or spirit, or God, in a mathematical way of thinking. The math of God. Don't forget that this sequence is an intimate part of nature itself. I'm going to call it source. It is the source of all mathematical sequences, and all life in existence grows based on phi. However, phi has no beginning and no end. Life doesn't know how to deal with that. It's like source says, go and replicate this, and life says, we don't know how. Because life doesn't know how to create from something that has no beginning. So it creates the Fibonacci sequence instead, which has a beginning, but starts out crude, very basic, and then continually goes closer and closer to source, becoming more divine every step. It does take steps too, which actually has quite a bit to do with evolution. Let's move on for now though. The only other sequence you need to know for this is binary sequences. This is a sequence like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. We're just doubling the last number instead of adding it to the previous one. We're all very familiar with this. Binary sequences are found in life as well. For example, mitotic cell divisions are binary. We go from being a single cell being to having over 100 trillion cells in only 46 divisions. Binary sequences are also how computers work, by turning on and off chips. Computing at its core anyways is binary. Okay, let's move on to something different for now, but what we just looked at will reveal itself in time. This is how a polar graph usually looks, with 36 radial lines in 10-degree increments representing the 360 degrees. Then, concentric circles are drawn, each with the same distance away as the last, creating 8 equal demarcations as the one before, counting the inside circle as 1. Think about what this represents too. It's a two-dimensional drawing of a three-dimensional sphere, one of the sacred forms, by projecting it onto a flat surface. This is also called a shadow form, and casting shadows is a sacred way to obtain information. Also, a polar graph has both straight, male lines, and circular, female lines, both male and female energies interacting at once. If you plot a golden mean spiral at 0 degrees on the polar graph, it will loop all the way around before hitting 0 again, exactly at the 8th circle. You'll find that this golden mean line crosses 5 specific places as it goes out. These places are where the female circular lines meet the male lines. It crosses at 120 degrees, 190 degrees, 240 degrees, 280 degrees, and then it jumps to 360, or back at 0, depending on how you look at it. What's interesting about this is that it creates both a binary and Fibonacci sequence. Looking at the radial increments from the center, it crosses at 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8. Well, that's Fibonacci, but it also crosses at 2, 4, and 8. Well, that's a binary sequence. We're going to look at the binary sequence in particular though, because what you find is very cool. If you draw lines from the outermost circles on the lines where the binary sequence was formed, you get this image. It is an equilateral triangle. If you continue the spiral outward, it would continue to hit these exact same places and continue to form larger equilateral triangles. Let's divert yet again to look at something very interesting. There was a man named Keith Critchlow who discovered something very important to understanding the geometry of music. First, he drew a straight line through an equilateral triangle, and then he measured from the middle of the center line and drew a straight line up to the top edge and back down to the bottom corner. Then he did the same, but passed through the center line of the top and back down again. He did this yet again on the other side. You can keep doing this on either side as well. By drawing this funny little form, he discovered something of great importance. He writes, continuing in this way, each successive proportion will be the harmonic mean between the previous proportion and the total length, and all of these proportions will be musically significant. 1/2 being the octave, 2/3 being the fifth, 4/5 being the major third, 8/9 being the major tone or step, and 16/17 being the half tone or step. In other words, he discovered the geometries of music, or at least one aspect of them. Then he tried measuring it in a different way, starting at a different point of the center line. At 3/4, he found the measurements were 1/7, 1/4, 2/5, 4/7, 8/11, and 16/19. All of these numbers are musically significant. This is very interesting. It means that the harmonics of music are somehow related to the proportions of the central line moving through a tetrahedron. Back to the polar graph, you can see that this drawing has a much greater value all of a sudden. Not only that, but it becomes even easier to make your measurements thanks to the polar graph itself. You can just draw a straight line through the drawing on the graph, and it will give you the center line. This information has been taken light years beyond what I just showed you though. A research team found that you can draw these lines not only from the center, but from any nodal points inside the upper half of the triangle, and you'll come up with all known harmonics in existence. Basically, this means that anywhere the straight line and curved lines on the polar graph cross from 0 to 120 degrees and start making the pattern, you will come up with all known harmonic systems. Not only the Western keyboard, but the Eastern, and even many unknown systems that have never been used. As I'm not a musician, there's not much more I can show you related to this, but I would love to see what a musician could really do with this knowledge. How far could you take this? Alright, I'm running low on time here, so I'll wrap up with this unraveling. Remember when we talked about spirals in nature? They often travel in twos. Usually this is male and female. So on this polar graph, if you're going to copy nature, you don't just plot one spiral, you have to plot two. When you do that, it gives you this image, which is a star tetrahedron inside of a sphere. We mentioned this in lesson 7, and this image is more commonly known as the Star of David. Do you remember the face on Mars? NASA obviously tells us that it's just a random formation on the surface of the planet. But right next to the face, there are also a few pyramids and other anthropomorphic structures. I know what you're thinking. Why on earth would I bring that up all of a sudden? Well, Richard Hoagland and his colleagues have spent a long time researching and deciphering a message on the surface of the red planet. Want to know what that message was? It was a star tetrahedron inscribed in a sphere. Holy balls, right? There's a link in the comments to a page with all of this information if you want to learn more. It's pretty crazy, and very eye-opening now that we have this information about what this really means. Inside the star tetrahedron, another one fits perfectly. We can continue to put more and more star tetrahedrons inside or outside of the other star tetrahedrons, the same way the golden mean spiral can wrap around the polar graph infinitely big or infinitely small. You'll notice that this smaller tetrahedron also happens to fit perfectly around this sphere. Well, check this out. If you put this same size sphere centered on the point of every single star tetrahedral point, guess what suddenly reveals itself? Fruit of life. It's back. According to the Egyptians, as well as the Ascended Masters, this is one of the holiest, most sacred forms in existence. Of course, we already learned one of its informational systems in Lesson 6, and what you just saw was the second, only in reverse order. What this means is that all of the information of music, harmonics, sound, and spirals come out of this image. Not only that, but light and the dimensional levels work in the same way as harmonics, which we've already discussed in Lesson 2, 7, and 9. Meaning that the geometric information about light and dimensions are also related to this star tetrahedron pattern. So just briefly, looking at this image that we looked at in Lesson 7, this is the fourth unraveling of the flower of life. It is an infinite spectrum of never-ending fruits of life within more fruits of life. This is the unraveling of dimensions, so it makes a little more sense now, but I won't have time to show you anything more today. So what you just saw was the second unraveling from the third rotational pattern of Genesis, the geometry at the heart of creation.
As you can see, geometry, the geometry of the ancients was very important in the very last thing I want to talk about, magic. Magic is perception. It is the ability to perceive energy patterns that are locked away. And of course, when you perceive these things, when you're off the island of the tonal, there is no language for you to bring back and say, oh, it means this, or I saw this, because there's nothing to describe it. So what they did is they made these mathematical and symbolic representations to help them to get back to that space so that they could perceive these things. Again, kind of like science. If I do this certain type of meditation, if I stop the world and stop the internal dialogue, and I concentrate on this feeling, this type of energy pattern, and I put my mind back in that space, then I can perceive it again and maybe perhaps manipulate it. For them, everything is energy, and everything is about being able to perceive that energy and to move it. So they sought to describe these processes in their symbols, and they made these elaborate stories around the symbols to help put the mind back in that space. Because really, all of reality comes from your mind. It's your mind perceiving something. And that's all it is. That's the totality of reality.